Hello, I'm Dr. Franklin Sollars. I'd like to welcome you to Transformation and Transcendence Roundtable podcast. We're going to discuss things spiritual, psychological, mystical. We're going to combine psychotherapy and psychological concepts since have all been trained as therapists, but all walk a spiritual path. We're going to combine all these elements and help with inspiration and guidance and coaching and support for each of you's spiritual growth. That's the intention. So we'll rely on case material. We'll rely on ancient wisdom as well as psychological awareness, depth psychology, Jungian psychology, Bionian psychology, different kinds of depth psychology that can be of help to you. So thanks for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the journey, and we hope to be of service to you and help you in your growth. That's our mission. So thank you, and here we go. So hello, everybody. Welcome back to Transformation and Transcendence Roundtable podcast. We have Bennett-Carpenter up on the top left of the screen. He's a life coach. And then Lea Dickinson, a therapist and a life coach. Farid Alsabeh, he's a therapist and a life coach. And Joshua Marrow, to the bottom left of my screen. You can imagine how my screen looks if you're doing audio. If you're doing YouTube, you might have the same view. So, okay, we talk everything spiritual. We use case material. We try to give specific kinds of examples by our work as to how to engage shadow elements in ourselves, transform them, pain points, things like that that need to be worked through. So it isn't just that we visualize the positive here. I mean, not that we don't do that, but we also work on impediments, obstructions, resistances to moving forward, to expanding ourselves, to finding more success and more joy. What's getting in the way? We spend time working on finding that and then helping resolve it so that our higher self and our passion and our joy and zest for life, among other things, gets liberated, you might say, to put a phrase to it. Okay, so here we go. We don't really have anything planned exactly, so we'll do what we usually do. We'll wait and see who wants to respond or wants to start.
Well, actually, I had a thought because I've been seeing some interesting patterns with some of the people that I've been working with, and I'm sure that many of you have as well. And one of the things that I notice is like a cyclical thing where basically the client or person gets really stuck in like a thought process or really stuck in like a situation that they're dealing with in their life. And it's hard to kind of get outside of that and start to see any other options, or even like, and this is very broad as well, but it can even go into like, if they're struggling in a relationship and it's hard to see outside of that struggle, or they have a hard time figuring out how to even see the other side and to begin to want to work towards that change. Because it's really easy, I think, for a lot of us to want to, pick blame, say, oh yeah, you're the person that's at fault. I'm not responsible in any way. But I think it's harder at times, even for our clients, to be able to sit back and go, yeah, I'm playing a role here too. And maybe there's a way that I can also help to move this in a direction where I can have closer connection with the person. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, Lea, when you were describing that, it made me think of a metaphor that I often use for helping people, which is it's like you're taking them up and giving them kind of like a bird's eye view of whatever they're going through. Because I feel like when we're in it and we're stuck with the feelings and the situations and this chronic state of emergency of one thing after the other, it can be hard to kind of take a step back, take a breath, and to see, as you mentioned, maybe other sides of it, how you might be contributing, taking perspectives of other people that'll shed light on whatever situation is happening. So yeah, the metaphor I often use is that a therapist or a life coach is like a helicopter pilot, and they'll take you where you're at, and then they'll take you up and give you that kind of bird's eye view, third person perspective, whatever you want to call it. That, yes, I think sometimes having that perspective can help you solve whatever problem you happen to be in.
Yeah, I like that that third person perspective, that helicopter view, Farid. And
Third person omniscient.
yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that comes to mind for me, Lea, and this, I think you've hit like on probably one of the primary issues that people come in for. I mean, for therapy, but also especially for coaching, of just that vague being stuck thing. And one of the things that comes to mind for me is you mentioned like something about creating options, or that they're, you know, kind of like not being in that they can't see that they're, I'm paraphrasing now, but that they're in a situation where it's like they're stuck and they don't see the options. And I'm just remembering one point in my own therapy process years ago, and my therapist was talking about like the idea of wanting to see options, create options. And I remember him just saying like, it's good to have options. And I was a little bit thrown off by that, because I didn't necessarily see that as an obvious thing. Like, who cares if you have options? I just wasn't, I was just sort of thinking like, I just want things to be better. I just want things to be different. Something like that. But I guess in a way I was kind of like very one track. But he would bring that up of like, it's good to have options, and we're looking at ways we can create some options for you. And I was kind of confused for a long time about that. But later then he would also add, you know, it's nice to be able to say no to things. And so I'm like, what? Like, so I was just sort of thinking like, I want things to be good. I want to be able to say yes. And I'm just, and he was kind of creating that sort of that map concept again, I guess. It's like, no, what if there are multiple options? And then what if it's, because part of the fear I think I had in having options is then, I might have to do it. Like, so it was a relief for me to hear him say, you know, create options, but then you can say no to them. So I was like, what? Like, so there was like two steps there of one, he's like, we're creating some freedom. I'm not as stuck. I'm not as trapped, but then also I'm not locked into those new options. Like, I can still just say, no, it's great to have that option, but no, I'm not going to do that. So I'm still kind of amazed by that dynamic, but that's where you got me thinking, Lea, on that one.
Yeah, Ben, that really spoke to me, because I also had an experience in my therapy process of realizing just how narrow my thinking was. And the thing about narrow thinking is you get stuck in it because it is quite effective. Like, when you're single-mindedly going on one track and you're really thinking about the details of one specific option, to use your word, it feels like you're doing something right. But I had a very similar experience where my therapist was giving me certain pieces of feedback and certain options that just, it seems like the image that's coming to mind this call is like broadening and also taking a higher perspective, because that was exactly what I went through too. And looking back, I can see how what to me seemed like the natural way of solving my problem it was actually a very narrow interpretation of the scope of what I was actually capable of and the options that I did have. And yes, I had this very eye-opening experience of realizing that, and then having my horizon, so to speak, broadened up by somebody, which I think is intrinsic to how humans deal with problems. Because if you think about our evolutionary heritage, like, we were never solving problems individually. We were always in a group setting, in a community, Where's the best place to find the next hunt? Where's the best place to pick berries? I think our problem solving capacities developed in a community setting where we were sitting down with people, sharing input, pointing out what our thinking process was like. So it is definitely no coincidence that you and I, Ben, and I'm sure many other people have had an experience where you realized, yes, we do need other people. We might be very effective at our individual problem solving, but there is always a benefit to involving another person, being in dialogue, in seeing what the limits of your thinking are, and then broadening it and being able to do more.
Yeah. In speaking to this, I just saw a client right before this, and she was super anxious about doctor's visits and specifically experiences where she didn't know what to expect, how they were going to feel, like physically, and and her thoughts were so anxious, and all I had to ask was like, what's another way that you could think about this? And that's all she needed to hear. And then she started thinking about all these other different ways of like considering how they might happen. And I could just see her anxiety just lower. And that like the same thoughts, that narrow sort of focused thinking that she's using to prevent herself from uncertainty and unexpected experiences was the same thing that was driving up her anxiety that would then potentially lead to those things happening. And so, yeah, like you said, sometimes we need someone else there just to be like, hey, what's another way of thinking about this? Or maybe consider this way of thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, so with all of the points so far that you've all brought, kind of bouncing off of this discussion continued, I've also even seen where clients get really, really overwhelmed when they're now given options. And then I see the anxiety increase exponentially. And it's almost like we've basically taken off on a rocket ship and we're about to hit Mars, like literally. And it can be, so for like some of them, it's really terrifying because maybe they haven't experienced the ability to problem solve through things. You know, maybe in their development, they were oftentimes on their own, and maybe their parental figure was more distant and less involved in their, you know, assisting them and helping them to figure things out. And so then we move into, you know, whether you're an adolescent or a teenager and then a young adult, because I see this a lot with the young adults too, of, okay, well, so how do I do this? And I wasn't taught that there were these options. So now I don't know how, like, even where to begin and what to even choose. And so then we enter into the rule book methodology, where clientele start thinking that there are certain rules that they have to follow in life in order to do things correctly. And so then having to unravel that, and I see a lot of you are shaking your heads like, yeah, because this is a thing that is very common with like clients when we see this type of an issue of increase of anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
You just grabbed my client.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think some of the more powerful experiences in coaching or therapy can be when using somebody as a sounding board and somebody to reflect on, you start to notice kind of those assumptions that you always make that have remained unexamined and that are limiting your ability to go out in the world and be as effective as possible. Mm-hmm. And I feel like, Lea, that's part of what you were describing is we have these kind of unspoken rules. Well, you can't consider that. That's not the right thing to do. There's no way that I would do this. And the thing about them that makes them so pernicious is that we don't really have a consciousness of them. They guide our movement through the world, and they're so determinative of what we end up doing and not doing, but it's hard to examine them on our own. Reaching out to another person, whether it's a therapist or a life coach, verbalizing what's on your mind, doing this kind of structured problem solving, you start to gain an awareness of these unspoken rules. By the way, some of them work. Some of them might actually be good. The real magic, though, is seeing the ones that, let's say they were good previously. Let's say you had a good reason to feel this way in high school, and now you want to examine them closer, and now you think, okay, well, this rule actually hasn't been helping me. this rule is actually holding me back and limiting my thinking, and I'd like to change it or tweak it or do whatever to be more effective in the world. A concept I'd like to introduce that I think is similar to what I've been talking about is psychological flexibility, right? Like, this is such a overarching goal of therapy and life coaching, whatever technique you're using. It's all about being able to contact the present situation in the most effective and creative way, and not having these kinds of rigid thought patterns and rules, as you said, Lea, that are guiding us, that may be holding us back. I think the ultimate goal in terms of self-improvement is to be able to respond to the present situation in the most effective way possible, in a way that reflects your higher values, and not in a way that is held back or obstructed by rigid ways of thinking. And I think that's precisely what somebody like a life coach or a therapist can help you to achieve.
Well, I'll jump in a little bit. When people get into kind of a vicious circle with their thoughts, and they don't see options, they don't see options. We can at times help them with options externally, that kind of thing. Yet another approach is what we're saying here, is that you help them understand that perhaps they have fear or they have anxiety about thinking about things differently, which again, then I think the real unhooking kind of quality, the thing that sets people free, is when they start looking at their inhibition to be flexible, or looking at what they're afraid of in terms of changing their point of view. What does it mean? For instance, some people may think, if I give in here, if I love this person and they're treating me poorly, that they're going to abuse me, right? Just for example, to be concrete. And that's not necessarily the case. You can love somebody who's being kind of nasty, and you can also be assertive, but you don't have to come back and be fight with them in the same way. You don't have to try to match them tit for tat, battling them, putting them down if they're doing that to you. You can say, ouch. You can say, I love you. Just, I don't appreciate that kind of way of being. And, you can try to take a constructive point of view, but the hook there may be, you feel if you don't fight them toe to toe, right, that somehow you're going to be walked on, pushover. And there's perhaps a third way that you may be afraid of. And it may be what we call a cognitive distortion, which goes in with this idea of psychological inflexibility, or sometimes called cognitive inflexibility, that there's an idea. If you change your mind, if you change your perspective a little bit and have it to be, although more accommodating, but more perhaps assertive, you express your needs more directly without punishing, without trying to get revenge, that you're talking about constructive kind of higher self ways of approaching a problem, that you're going to lose. But really, you become more effective, because when you're in it to fight to the death, because you're both locked in, you and other people, to a battle, it's hard to find this other person's point of view, and it's hard for them to help them understand your point of view in a way that you can have a negotiative kind of truce come out of it eventually. So that's maybe a little bit long-winded, but the point is that there's fears we have of being more flexible and looking for more options, and that's part of our work too. Is what's getting in the way of trying a different direction? What are we afraid of? What are we worried about? What do we fear is going to happen? That kind of thing. Anyway, so that's my little add in there. Yeah.
It makes me think of Yalom with one of his things with the obstacles, where it's like the therapy is about removing obstacles and helping people, get out of their own way. And with the assumptions and the rigidity, I personally see that as like, they're afraid of something that if they don't think this way, or if they don't assume this thing, like you were saying in your example, Dr. Sollars, that something bad might happen, or that this negative experience that I've had in the past will happen to me again, or there's some sort of, it's a protective mechanism, that rigidity and those assumptions. And like, you have to be able to be okay with uncertainty and not knowing what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's
Be able
dealing
to-
with the kind of accepting the fear or the anxiety, which really also contains fear. You know, anxiety is kind of how can I say it? A word that covers a lot of different things, right? But one thing about it is that you're afraid of something when you're anxious, right? You're afraid of something. You're afraid of being rejected. You're afraid of, you're going to do something that's going to mess something up, like people liking you, people are going to abandon you emotionally. There's something like that that's happening with anxiety. Something's going to go awry, And so part of any kind of work is to not be any kind of like growth work, spiritual, therapeutic, otherwise, is to try to be like experience accepting in yourself. Doesn't mean you have to let some new thought rule you. I think as Ben was saying, options don't have to rule you. And understanding your feelings, it doesn't have to force you to act a certain way. But if you can examine, like say, what you're afraid of, maybe you're afraid of being passive. Maybe you're afraid of being a doormat. Maybe if it has to do with success or expansion, you're afraid that somehow people are going to envy you, judge you, you don't deserve it. These are other kind of cognitive issues that may get in the way, right? If you could let yourself know that you have these, maybe a coach can help you or your therapist can help you, help you understand you have some of this going on by reflection and interpretation and stuff like that you can begin to breathe and just accept it. That's what it is. And then challenge the thoughts about that. I mean, is that really true that you're undeserving? Why do you feel undeserving if you do? Maybe that's a little work. But a lot of times it's just something we've internalized from our history, that kind of thing that we can begin to challenge and use kind of just exposure, like be with it, sit with it and try to accept it and breathe through it. And the feelings then begin to change and the fears and negativities often become more positive in a relatively short time. And they may come back, but then if you use the same process of accepting your fear, accepting your whatever it might be, your resistances to expansion, to love, to better relationships, that they begin to soften. And you learn through that process, organically, you learn different options occur to you, right? Third options, fourth options. But if you're restricted, your cognitive restriction because you're afraid and you're angry, these options don't appear. They don't appear. You get confirmation bias. Your world seems to continually to confirm, your negative, fearful point of view rather than you've got other options, and you see other options in the world, and you see perhaps beyond other people's defensiveness or negativities, and they don't hurt you so much, and they don't stab you so much. Not that they say ouch, but they just don't mean as much because you see that they're another person struggling. I don't mean you just see it, you feel it because you're feeling your own ambivalence, your own fears, your own negativity. You can start to feel it in them too, and I think it helps us feel like we're on the same team somehow. They're not all right. We're not all right. They're not all wrong. We're not all wrong. Let's try to. We'll find a way. We'll find third, fourth, fifth option.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Oh, if I could, and I think there could be many fears there, but one of the fears that comes to mind for me is just like the loss of oneself. So, like if I'm stuck, that might suck, but at least I kind of pretty much know who I am, and
it's me that's sucking.
It might.
Still here, right?
Yeah, it's me exactly. Yeah, it's me that's sucking. At least I know that.
Yeah.
But like part of the fear that when you talk about fears, one of the things that comes up for me is, I mean, if you start creating options or you start to look at yourself, there's a fear like, oh shit, I'm gonna be lost here, or I mean, not to get too extreme, but it might start to feel like I'm gonna die, or and then I think this gets into then maybe I mean, this is real easy to say, but we could just jump to, well, what we're really talking about is conceptions of ourselves, but that's not how it feels. I mean, it feels like this is me. If I lose this, I feel like I'm going to die, or I feel like I'm going to be totally lost, or what have you.
Because my identity is over here. And if I entertain new values and new options and new ways of being, well, maybe that's fine, but is that really me? Because I'm so used to this. This is the way I've been in the world. I mean, that's kind of defines me, you know. What do I do? I'm trying to elaborate what you're saying a little bit, you know. This new
Absolutely.
way of being, maybe it's someone else, not even me, that kind of thing, you know. Okay, Lou, go ahead.
I have so many thoughts that are swirling in my head. So Ben, thank you, because you just gave me a third thought. But you know, when it comes to like what you're talking about, I can also see how like that loss can, or this can spin out into all sorts of different types of fears that people have. And like if you already feel like this experience of like wanting to not even know that what's actually happening with inside of you is that you kind of feel this need of, I'm going to die if I think any differently than the way I have it, then it's going to be really hard to work with that resistance until the resistance part of self is ready to step aside and allow the core self to come in and effectively begin to change that. And so one of the things that I was thinking of is that, you know, we all have so many parts of who we are. And I think sometimes what happens is we get really stuck with this idea that certain things identify or make us who we are. And then we can get so stuck in that way of thinking that we actually realize that the identification with, you know, whatever it is, whether it be like way of doing things, can actually be more harmful than helpful. And then as we start to tease it apart and we start to go, well, this isn't necessarily you, this is a symptom, or this is a thing that you're experiencing, then it doesn't feel so like personal when somebody is coming at you and it feels like you're being attacked for it, like you're doing something wrong. I recently actually had a really in-depth conversation with someone not too long ago about this. And it's interesting. It was like a freeing experience. And then the other thing is like, for myself, I've been coming to my own recognizing, and I was told this a while ago, but now it's very clear, and it's something that runs through my head all the time, especially when I think about this training that I'm going to be doing. I go, oh my gosh, I'm so afraid of success. Oh, I'm so afraid of a failure. I'm literally experiencing two different issues at the same time, and I'm like, okay.
It's a tight wire walk, isn't it?
Oh my gosh, it is. But I'm literally allowing myself to feel it, even though I want to run. I literally do. But I'm also telling myself, no, that has been your go-to at times. You're not running. And also you have lots of people who are encouraging and supporting you. And you also know that you can do it. And so it's like having to literally walk figuratively this tightrope, like, because I could fall over either way, but I'm not going to. I'm choosing to like keep going. So like even as like coaches, therapists, like we are human too. We also experience these things. And these are things that we're all working on as well.
Mm-hmm. Lea, so much of what you shared reminds me of acceptance and commitment therapy. And what you described earlier, the word I think in ACT would be cognitive fusion. There are certain ideas and thoughts that people have that are such an intrinsic part of their private experience that it's like water to fish. And often the first step towards psychological flexibility, which is the ultimate goal of ACT, is to separate the experiencing self from those kinds of negative thoughts. So oftentimes I found with clients and people in general, it takes the form of a vague, like, something's wrong with me, I'm different, I'm fundamentally not acceptable. If people knew who I really was, they wouldn't accept me. So cognitive fusion would be happening when someone's going out into the world with this thought, but it just pervades their experience and they're not really able to challenge it because, again, the fish and water example, it's just a part of their functioning in the world. What ACT encourages us to do is to separate, and the word is diffusion, unsurprisingly enough, and to really start to think of this thought as almost like something objectified, something external. And in fact, what I think is really cool, some ACT therapists or life coaches who are using it will encourage this by even asking the clients questions like, okay, this thought, what does it look like? Is it a spiky thing? Is it a slimy thing? How does it smell? What color is it? And this will really develop this sense in people of, this is not a given of my experience. This is something that's happening to me. This thought is overcoming me in these moments. And now they can start to challenge it a bit because, again, the defusion has occurred. It's not such a big part of their experience anymore.
I've encountered that. And the trouble that I find sometimes is that that defusion can be hard for people if they feel like that part of them or that aspect of their identity is central to their protection. If they feel like they have to have this to protect themselves, it's going to be so hard for them to be able to separate from it. Yeah.
It might be the desire to run, like Lea was talking about. It might be negativity. It might be cynicism. It might, anything, pessimism. It might be, things like that keep us separated and keep us resistant to expansion. But if those are a big part of your identity and you can't, like in terms of ACT, diffuse them, or in other points of view, like observe them with your observing self and realize that they are thoughts and that you have essentially a personality that doesn't necessarily have to include them. If you can't do that, then you're stuck. So that's probably a big part of what coaching would be. And we do this often, right? We do this often without even thinking much about it. We've sort of internalized these ways of dealing with ourselves and with people. We began to talk like this, but this is really important, I think, to articulate this, that helping people diffuse or separate out that is this really essential to me? Is my negativity, is my pessimism, is my cynicism, is my fear, is that really essential to who I am? Or is it really debilitating and something I need to work on? Accept, radically accept, feel it, and then begin over time to challenge it. This is not necessarily defining of me. And there's a really good core self in there, really good person in there that doesn't have to be defined by cynicism. Yeah, can be optimistic, can be positive. And if it doesn't work, okay, I'll come back. I'll go back to the drawing board and I'll keep going. Because one particular moment of not making it failure doesn't have to define my entire way of being, right? Because we all make mistakes, and that's part of life. And if you expect that you're never going to make a mistake, and that's why you hold on to your cynicism, pessimism, doubt, that needs to be challenged too.
Yeah, that's really important what you just said, Dr. Sollars, because I think that is another reason why people feel stuck or they run or they just don't want to deal with it, is because of that fear that things are just not going to work out. They're going to be the same as they were before. Or, like that they've had experiences that have really communicated that, and that cognitive distortion just kind of plays out. But something that can be also helpful, and I do this with my clients who tend to have anxiety, is okay, but at the same time, anxiety can be actually a very positive, helpful thing. If we didn't have anxiety at all, then we wouldn't have the ability to be able to have any sense of fear or to know which way to go or whatnot. Especially if something dangerous is right in front of us, like a bear or a wolf. Well, not a wolf. I think wolves could probably be okay, but like a polar bear, that's actually really dangerous. They will attack without any hesitation. Seriously, this is why the people in Alaska have to carry guns around. But it is interesting. Just making sure that people just kind of realize that, you do have that opportunity and that ability to be able to change the way that you think about things. And also to consider the idea that, with anxiety too, the positives, or like looking at it in a different way and recognizing how it could be benefiting you, but how it could also not be benefiting you, giving those like pros and cons is really, I've found, helpful for clients, and sometimes helps them start looking at things in a totally different way. Because I can tell you, I never heard that when I was in therapy myself, and I think it's really helpful.
Yeah. And
Go
I
ahead.
think a big part of the process for people is to accept whatever blocks they're having. And as you said, Lea, to recognize that the blocks are actually coming from a place where your mind wants to help you. It's just not 100% correlated with your specific situation. The reason why it's important to get that idea across is because I've noticed some people, here's how I think of it. They have the initial block, okay, but then just as strong and problematic as the initial block is the attitude they have about the block. So for example, someone may be experiencing anxiety, sure, but then they have this secondary layer of, well, that means I'm a weak person, or that means something's wrong with me. How come no one else is happening to them? Oftentimes I find the first step is not to actually address the anxiety per se, but to address the person's attitude towards their anxiety or whatever other negative experience they're having. Because a lot of times you will find invalidation, you will find people thinking that they're unique in this way, something's wrong with them. And I think a big part of diffusing it first is to just tell them, this is something that your mind is doing because it's actually trying to help you. This is not pathological in and of itself. And then I like to sometimes even give the evolutionary context, right? So something like anxiety warns us about threats. And being warned about threats is the only reason why you're here with us today, because every single one of your ancestors was able to correctly appraise threats to the point that they were able to keep the next generation going. It's just that your threat detection system is a little bit off, right? It's a little bit off. It's going off, to use Josh's example, it's going off when you're in a doctor's appointment, when there's nothing there, and this detection system is going off. So let's try to tweak it. Let's sit down with it. I accept you, signal detection system, for what you are in my experience. But now I just want to tweak you very gently and very compassionately. And that is a fundamentally different attitude to have than, oh my God, this anxiety is coming back again. Oh, I suck. It sucks that this anxiety is coming up. No one else has to deal with this. In that case, you actually have two problems. You have the initial anxiety, sure, but then like I said, you have that negative self-attitude, the negative appraisal, and that to me is what really makes it stick. So it seems like a through line of our discussion so far has been the first step just being, as Dr. Sollars said, acceptance. Like, okay, this is a part of your mind that was originally meant to help you, and it's not really working for you anymore. That's okay. Let's accept it. There's nothing wrong with you. But now we're going to tweak it in a helpful way to hopefully get you to be more effective in your world. And that attitude, I think, is the therapeutic attitude that then gets people to face the real problem and start to make changes that are effective for them.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to have to stop in just a second. But I wanted to add a little bit of a reframe from different points of view. Like Rumi would call anxiety, right, a guest at your house, right? A guest that you want to welcome them as a guest in your house. Other people might call anxiety or problems a teacher. Others, these are advanced people who are not in the duality of good and bad, problem and not problem. It's really that all that life comes to you as meaning, right? And is for your advancement. So the other way of looking at it is that they're gifts. Now that's a radical upside down to treat anxiety or depression or malice or something that comes your way as a gift, even really some kind of harsh reality that you experience. But from a spiritual, mystical point of view, life comes to you because you need the teacher. You always need the teacher. Now you can turn away from it and say, but if you approach it as a teacher, you're going to learn and you're going to grow. If you keep working at it, it'll come. And keep accepting, radically accepting, it'll come. So I guess I get the last word today, unless anybody else wants to say something quick. Anybody?
Just a amen.
Okay, all right. All right, thanks, you guys. We'll see you all next week. Oh,
Thank
I
you.
wanted to say, if you want to reach us for help, and anybody wants somebody to work with them with this kind of material, in this kind of way, you can reach us at, email is tntroundtablepodcast@gmail.com. That's TANDT, Transformation and Transcendence. TNT Roundtable Podcast @gmail.com or 248-787-0855. And one of us will be happy to help you. Okay. All right. So other than that, thanks everybody. We'll see
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for being part of our Transformation and Transcendence Roundtable podcast. We'll be having this podcast every Thursday at 12 noon, but then it will be uploaded where you could be able to find it on any podcast platform that you have, Apple, Spotify, etc. And it should be on, will be on YouTube as well. So thanks for joining us, and we hope it's been helpful in your spiritual and emotional growth, and that you've gleaned a little bit of blessing and insight and inspiration for your growth as you go forward. May it blossom throughout your day. Okay, thanks again. See you next time.